So pleased to have this esteemed panel up here on stage with me. Again, my name's Farzana Nayani. I'm the National Director of ERG Relations for NAP, the National Association of Asian American Professionals, and I do diversity and inclusion consulting. We have a number of people here who are experts in their field. So again, we have Carmela Clendening, who's the Director of State and Local Government Affairs for Salesforce. Let's give her a warm welcome. To her left, we have Amanda Greenberg, the CEO of Balloonr. Let's welcome her. To her left, we have Tariq Meyers, Head of Inclusion and Diversity at Lyft. So let's welcome him. And we have Dr. Melissa Abad, researcher at Stanford University. So a big warm welcome to everyone again. Now, today's panel this afternoon is entitled Disrupting Diversity on the West Coast. And we're really looking at how the West Coast has taken a lead on diversity and inclusion and why it's so important on the West Coast, as well as how companies and research organizations and startups like we have here up on stage have really introduced new and diverse ways of engaging, right? And this could be through technology or through processes or through actually disrupting the processes, right? Just in the seats that you hold. So as we begin, if we could have each panelist just share a brief introduction, just 2 minutes, about your role with diversity and inclusion and a little bit about how your organization engages with it. And so let's start over here with Dr. Abad. I'm going to keep calling you doctor because if you're a doctor, we need to holler out the degrees here. Okay, thank you.
I really do appreciate it. It's funny you should say that. I text my sister. I was like, I just made a new friend, and she's introducing me as doctor, and I love it.
Dr. Melissa Abad.
8 years of hard work. To keep it simple, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I get to two things. Three things. One, collect stories. Two, unpack the challenges women of color face in the workplace. And three, work with organizations on how to change their policies, right? So I'm a relatively new member of the research team at the Clayman Institute in their work on advancing women's leadership because they recognize we're having this conversation, but we're not looking at intersectionality. And I get to do all of that all the time. So I get paid to have fun. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Tariq.
Doc. Appreciate it. I'm also going to call you doctor. 8 years of hard work. Hello, everyone. Tariq Meyers, Head of Inclusion and Diversity for Lyft. Not a seasoned diversity inclusion practitioner by any means. Actually started my work out here in the West Coast in government relations for Lyft and quickly transitioned, realizing that a lot of the challenges we were facing in the policy sector when it came to inclusive policymaking were pretty evident in the tech sector as well. I've been doing this for about 1.5 years now, and I think for us at Lyft, our framework for the way we approach diversity and inclusion, in short, or at least where I come in, is from the C-suite and down and everywhere else in between. I focus on how do we make sure that we're attracting the best talent, selecting the best talent in the most equitable and bias-free way, but more importantly, developing and retaining that talent. So you'll see me in everybody's business, from recruiting all the way up to our business operations and everything else in between, to make sure that we're reflecting the experiences of all of you, as well as making sure that we're building an inclusive workforce where folks want to stay, grow, and develop. So pleasure being here, and excited for an exciting conversation.
Thank you, Tariq.
Hi, everyone. I'm Amanda Greenberg. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Balloonr. Our app removes bias from collaboration, decision-making, and innovation so that companies and organizations gain access to otherwise unreachable insights, really foster an idea meritocracy, and drive a more inclusive culture. A little bit of background. So before founding Balloonr, I was a public health researcher in DC. And it was actually in that role that I noticed a number of different trends, whether it was louder, more senior voices dominating conversations, or people's ideas or information, their feedback being evaluated differently based on who they were, whether that was title, role, gender, ethnicity. And I knew that these things were really hurting just the bottom line of our firm. And so I was a researcher, dug into the research, and what I found just shocked me, which is that our current collaboration tools, information collection tools, all these things that we use that are core to how companies operate don't actually align with well-studied research-supported best practices for how you get not only the best and most diverse information ideas out of a group, but how do you just create a more productive culture, make better decisions, drive more innovation. And so with that, I became passionate and obsessed with that problem and started a company with the goal of fixing it. And of course, as an early stage founder and CEO, I'm focused every day on how I grow the most diverse, inclusive culture and team. And also I work every day with leads of D&I from Fortune 50 companies, hospitals, schools, universities, and fast-growing tech companies. So excited to be here.
Great, thank you. Carmela.
Yep, Carmela Clendening, Head of State and Local Government Affairs for Salesforce. One of Salesforce's core values is equality. I think that's something very unique to the company. Not many Fortune 500 companies, I think, have equality as a core value. And how we as a company practice the 4 pillars of equality is through equal rights, equal pay, equal opportunity, and equal education. As the head of government affairs, I have been at the forefront in our fight for equal rights, specifically in regards to discriminatory and anti-LGBTQ laws in states like Indiana, Georgia, and North Carolina. So my charge in my role has been in that sense, and that's how I play a role for D&I within the company. And quickly on background, I worked for 7 years for Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, so it's really exciting to be able to, continue some of the work that she's done in that role, and not only like continuously focus on privacy and data security, because that stuff is core to the company, right? But the other stuff is much more fun.
So I'm noticing an interesting trend. I don't know if you all noticed. We all have public policy and community affairs backgrounds. And so it goes to show you how important that intersection of different industries in terms of public agencies, nonprofit, and corporate can work together, right, and can produce leaders that have a large vantage point for the work that we do. And related to that, I think it's important to look at, how we really build the case for diversity. And so the different hats that we wear allow us to do that. And so I'm wondering in your organizations how you build that case for diversity. How have you done it? What has been something that has been a compelling argument? Maybe it's overcoming a challenge, or maybe it's the case for it itself. So perhaps we can start over to the right. So Carmela.
So it was one of the things, and it's just, interesting that the panel before us was the ERG panel, because it was the ERGs at Salesforce, specifically Outforce, our LGBTQ resource group, that told us that there were discriminatory laws being passed in states where we have a big footprint. And again, as I told you before, it wasn't necessarily something that was like part of my charge to focus on social justice issues. And it has become a much more important issue for the company ever since we've stuck our neck out on it. And so our CEO, he believes in this theory he calls CEO stakeholder theory, that the business of business is to do good in the world, and that the value that we bring is not only to our shareholders, but all of our stakeholders. And as Jimmy said earlier, our stakeholders not only includes our customers, but includes our employees and the communities that we live and work in. And so in terms of having D&I as part of what I do, it's really coming from the top, but also from the bottom. So as Mark leads the charge, the employees are emboldened to be more outspoken, and at times it could be fun, and at times it can be a little difficult.
So I think the case for D&I is, new research is coming out all the time that just shows the benefit of eliminating bias and how it drives better business outcomes. I think we're just seeing more and more of that. So, I always rely on the research. There was a recent study that came out from the Center for Talent Innovation that found that employees who perceive bias are 3 times more likely to be disengaged from their work, 3 times more likely to leave their current position within a year, and 2.6 times more likely to have withheld an innovative solution or something that would have been a market game changer from the company. And so we're seeing more and more work in this area. And remember, that's just the perception of bias. So people thinking that their workplace is unfair. That doesn't even account for the actual, all these different costly types of bias, whether it's groupthink, implicit bias, pattern recognition, et cetera. So there's just more and more research coming out that, better decisions result from having more diverse viewpoints, a more diverse team, across the board. And so I think relying on that research and that data is always the easiest way to make the case because it's so tied to increases in revenue, innovation, et cetera.
Wonderful. Similar sense, I think for us at Lyft, when I took on this role and was thinking about our strategy, it was pretty easy from the beginning to really make the case for inclusion and diversity for a number of reasons. 5 years ago when our co-founder set on this mission in San Francisco, actually in Oakland, out of a garage, it was funky. But 5 years ago, they had this mission and this vision where all these outsiders, so all the folks that were told no, so whether they were students who were trying to get home and make a little bit of extra cash, whether it was moms who had gaps in their resumes or other caregivers who were having trouble getting jobs, it was veterans transitioning from active duty to civilian life, it was young men and women of color who just weren't finding employment opportunities in a recovering economy, and so on and so forth. All these folks now had this new opportunity for earning potential, right? And for folks who are from the 510, from Oakland, that it's really tough to get a cab sometimes in certain neighborhoods, right? So there was all these different issues related to transportation access and transportation being the number one barrier for economic mobility. And so that was the spirit of what the Lyft platform was from the beginning. It was this idea of creating a transformative experience where anyone, no matter who you are, what you look like, who you pray to, who you love, how you love them, and so on and so forth, had a place in the front seat. It's why our company's mantra started with this idea of your neighbor with a car. So 5 years later, when we go to found our inclusion and diversity program, it was really important for us to do a few things. The first was to create a transformative experiences for our team members so that we can then create a transformative experience for you. Right. The second piece was make sure that we were reflecting if we really wanted to win and beat the competitor that won't be named. But if we really wanted to win, hopefully no one's from that competitor in the room, but if you are, only love. But one of the other challenges was if we really wanted to gain majority market share, realizing that the face of America was changing, and by 2042, would be majority people of color and Asian and Pacific Islanders being the fastest growing demographic in this nation, that we really had to make sure our teams reflected that diversity, right? And then more importantly, we wanted to make sure that we were creating inclusive experiences where folks would want to stay, because ultimately we want people to be a part of that moment when we actually transform the way folks move around cities and build that infrastructure going forward.
Okay. So the Clayman Institute is, I believe, the oldest feminist research think tank at a university in the country. And so about 4 years ago, they started this initiative. It's the Center for the Advancement of Women's Leadership. And so the goal was a couple of things. One, the data, the research has been around forever. But the question is how do we make it accessible? How do we actually put research into practice? And so we've been working through our corporate affiliates program with a variety of organizations on how to address gender bias. But in the work, they realized, oh, wait, we're missing a lot of people because focusing on women doesn't address all the forms of difference. And so my position was created about a year and a half ago, I think, to really look at the intersection of race and gender, right? With the goal of, yes, we collect the data, yes, we're having these conversations, but how do we work with companies to actually change the organizational culture and processes, right? So we look at things from recruitment and hiring all the way to stretch assignments. And so how do we collect data at these different stages to help companies identify what the barriers are, what the challenges are, and what are the best practices to address the gaps?
So this is fascinating stuff, and it sounds to me like at a macro level, you've done a lot of work with creating that case and maintaining that case and sustaining it. I'm wondering from your vantage point and to do with the topic today, how have you or your company, how has there been disruption in terms of what's been looked at with D&I on the West Coast, if you're aware, versus other parts of the country? And how can that be a model for some of us in the room, right? So why is disruption a good thing? That's a really hot topic when we're looking at undoing things that are just norms or conditions we're used to. But how can we incorporate that into our daily practice or our own company? So maybe, Tariq, could you share just to start off?
Sure. So the West Coast. So I grew up from Boston. Dorchester, that's my hood, which is great. Shout out to Boston, see? But I think what I've realized, so, Silicon Valley, the center for innovation, and then we have a lot of our legacy industries like banking and finance and others on the East Coast. I've seen a difference in the way we've done it out here that's been pretty inspiring. I think what we're finding is a few things, and shout out to Salesforce for leading the way on this. But I think that, one, we're finding that the relationship between the employee and the employer is changing, right? Where employees now are emboldened to hold their employers accountable and to call their employers out, right? And that is beautiful. I think that is a change model that I haven't seen. When we think about, affirmative action, this transition into multiculturalism, and finally where we are now in this day and age, I haven't seen that, exist elsewhere. And that's something that's very different that's happening in, I think, a lot of Silicon Valley-based companies. And employees and team members taking ownership over their experiences and saying, CEO, co-founders, whatever the case may be, I need you to reflect my values or I won't be working here much longer. That level of accountability is brilliant. I think that what leads to that also is that there's been a re-emphasis on what company culture and belonging looks like. So, when we talk of the reason why we named our program Inclusion and Diversity versus Diversity and Inclusion was simply that, we wanted to make sure that we were doubling down on our investment in our company's culture and to let folks know that like belonging can be measured. And there's tons of tools out there to measure belonging on your teams where folks don't get left out in the margins. So that's one of the things that we implemented pretty early. We created a pretty robust, leveraging a few tools, engagement and inclusion survey to really at the most granular level measure how team members felt connected to not only our mission and vision, but each other, their managers. So we created metrics that focused on connection to the company, connection to a manager, and connection to each other. And then we produced some pretty phenomenal insights from that. And then going beyond that, because we all like to collect data, but we don't always know what to do with it, we then empowered our people business partners to work with each and every department head to create actionable plans that would up-level to the CEO of how to increase our belonging scores and our engagement scores. So I would say like company culture and measuring belonging is two things that are top of mind for how this valley is really being able to disrupt the industry. Do you care which way?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's go to the right.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo all of that. I think, West Coast and Silicon Valley companies, we've just seen that like toxic cultures and being discriminatory and having companies filled with like bias is just not going to work. And we've seen people taken down from power and post so quickly. And I think it really led the way. And so when I think about our customers that are West Coast companies versus like Midwest companies or East Coast companies, you start to see that trickle. You saw it when we moved from the VC world to entertainment in terms of sexual assault and sexual harassment cases. And so I think that as kind of things spread, as people become more aware, more focused on these different issues, you see an increase in the need for education and awareness and metrics, data, all these things to measure it. But I see the West Coast as really leading the way there.
Echo everything that was said from Tariq and Amanda. Just a couple points from a data standpoint. Earlier this year, the Salesforce research arm, we commissioned a study of 1,500 different individuals to show the impact of equality in a values-driven business. 80% of professionals want to work for a company that has a positive impact on society. 51% of customers say that their loyalty is influenced by a company they believe is doing, quote, good. 11 out of 14 senior executives say promoting equality in the workplace is more important now than it was 2 years ago. So making sure, and this is what Tariq was saying earlier, that we are connecting with our employees is a recruitment and retention thing for us. It makes sure that, because we are constantly competing against other technology companies for talent. And this is one way that we keep talent, frankly. I think the original question, Farzana, forgive me, was it specifically on West Coast trends?
So how are we disrupting things here?
How are we disrupting things here? From a Salesforce perspective, we have this online learning platform called Trailhead. It is something that we have been using, I think, for a couple of years now. It's a free online learning platform. We started it because Salesforce is one of the within the top 10 on-demand skills, it's as ubiquitous as Excel or PowerPoint. So people are really looking for Salesforce admins, Salesforce developers. And so we've been trying to cultivate Trailhead to be used in different models for unconscious bias. And so that's some of the things that we're using within our company.
Great, thank you. Dr. Melissa?
Oh my God. So I'm new, right? I haven't been here a year, and I have an interesting geography story. Sorry, but anyway, in terms of disrupting, I don't know that we're disrupting anything. What I'll share are my observations, being a Chicagoan who went to high school on the East Coast. And so what I'll say is this: there is a difference between the sort of the finance and sort of the older industries versus tech, the new industry. I think one, the conversation is there's a system of accountability that exists that maybe wasn't there in the older industries. But I think for me, what's interesting as a researcher is it's starting with gender. And why is gender the easy win? That's the question I'm asking. One, why do we start with gender? Two, why is it so institutionalized addressing gender diversity and not the other dimensions of diversity? Three, when I'm in spaces that are talking about diversity and inclusion, we talk about race and gender for like 2 seconds, and then we talk about introversion. Why? Why are we so scared of these things? And more specifically, what's the point of departure when we talk about diversity and inclusion? Is it just gender? Is it just race? Is it, what axis do we focus on? And as a researcher, I'm like, we don't pick one, we pick several. Because my argument is, if we look at the mess and unpack the mess, then we can talk about how to fix the structure.
Well, I think that's powerful, and all that you've shared is important for us to consider. And I'm thinking about, as we're getting to know each other up here, if I could ask you a personal question. So we're, right? Off the script. Let's see how we do. So I'm thinking about structures and how our companies are doing things to disrupt, and how we have D&I practices that are best practices, but yet there's still things proliferating, right? In the news and in our personal experiences, like the cubicle next door, you hear something, right? And so I'm wondering how, in your daily lives, how do you interrupt those moments, right? And if we're talking about Balloonr's got this tech application to overcome bias, this is great, and we have all the systems in place, for example. But in your daily practice, how do you do it, considering you have the weight of the role you're in, the knowledge you have, which a lot of people don't. You've done the work, you have the public background. So I'm just thinking if you can think of an example where you were successful and how you can model it to us. So the rest of us, when we see something about, something said about women, or, those Asians over there working really hard or doing what we do, I don't know. I find that's a challenge, right, for us. So, Carmela, you're thinking in deep thought.
Farzana's trying to be Oprah here, trying to make us go all deep.
Asian Oprah. By the way, I'm Asian. I just want to say, a lot of people wonder what my background is. I'm mixed. My mom's from the Philippines. My dad's Pakistani Indian. So if you're like, because sometimes I go to events and people are like, wow, you're really into the Asian stuff. How come you're... They don't know I'm Asian. So I'm going to put that out there. Okay. So Carmela, sister.
Filipina sister.
There you go.
How you doing? Okay. So I'm literally trying to rack my brain in regards to an example of success recently.
Or maybe a not success. I mean,
I can tell you of a
things.
not success.
Yeah, let's do
I
that.
can definitely tell you of a not success.
Okay.
I was recently in a meeting with an unnamed organization. Much older white man was just talking about the political landscape going into 2018 and some of the things that they were doing to try and get more engagement from organizations that they hadn't gotten engagement from before. And in the middle of his sentence, he goes, we're trying to figure out whether or not a Chinaman could get into that race. Oh. And I was so shocked. I had no idea. I had literally not heard that term in decades. And I did not know how to react. And I was kicking myself, and the rest of the conversation was like gone for me because I had no idea how to like even respond to that. And it was with an organization that wanted to partner with us. And of course, we're not partnering them. Enough said. But that is an example of where I think I failed initially because just I didn't know how to react to it right on the spot. Now, in situations where I have succeeded, in my previous life when I worked on Capitol Hill and worked for Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi, it was my job to make sure that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders had a seat at the table. And in many situations on the Hill, I was the only Asian American or woman at the table. And it was tough being at mid-20s, representing an entire community in front of much older, seasoned people, but I had a role to do. And people wouldn't think that a specific issue such as getting Filipino veterans their due after fighting in World War II is something that, is very important these days, but it was symbolic to the Filipino American community. So that's my story of doing something successful and something recently that I was not successful in. Thank you, Oprah, for opening me up.
Well, yes. No, I'm so glad you shared that. And something I've observed that's come up in the room is the Asian American and then the Asian diaspora, differences in our community, what we have in common, but this idea of us racing against other countries. Now, if we are from those countries, like India or China, where things are, competitive, and we're here, then how do we carry both identities at the same time, right? How do we advocate for our companies to be successful, but then also plausibly this undercurrent of the other comes up and us as perpetual foreigners can occur, right? And I remember the idea of how the melting pot doesn't work for us Asians because you put us in the pot and we still come out looking Asian. We don't melt, right? And so this was said to me, and I thought to myself, yes, this idea of being perpetually foreign or other. And so how we carry that, right, in our lives. So maybe we could turn now to Tariq. Have you had some success or challenge in facing an opportunity to overcome bias or something that was said in your presence?
Every damn day. It happens
Right.
every day, right?
Sure. Talk to us.
I think that, I had this moment, I think it was like 3 years ago or something like that. But I had this moment where I realized that, people of color, no matter what, and just marginalized communities in general, just based on their lived experiences, negotiate this world with this lens that's so dynamic that I realize that others haven't had the privilege of being able to negotiate the world with, right? And it's like this really beautiful thing where in many ways, marginalized communities, because they've lived at the margins, have witnessed and experienced so much that they do wield the moral authority to call somebody out, Mm-hmm. So I do that often.
How do you do it? Can you teach us?
Yes.
Sensei, Tariq?
I do it often. So I have teachable moments all the time. And I think it's important because I think it's important to bring people along. And when I talked about the lens that a lot of our marginalized communities experience, because I also recognize that the center just hadn't had to think about many of these things in many of their lives. I hear all the time, I want to be an ally, but I don't know how. And I really think that's genuine, The issue when you work for a company like Lyft or Salesforce or LinkedIn where we model our values to the front, where everything touches our values, that sometimes you create a culture of niceness where the intention is to assume good intent each and every time, but the reality is that not everyone comes to the table with good intent. So there have been plenty of situations where, and I can speak to many, where I've had to really have teachable moments with folks. A great example is, creating a behavior shift in an organization where folks stop referring to underrepresented candidates as diversity hires, right? Or as diverse candidates. Like, I don't know what that means, frankly. And I have these moments in meetings all the time where I'm like, what do you mean by that? Well, a candidate that's, Asian or black or Latino. I'm like, why are you whispering? Just say what they are. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm here, I'm a brother. So I have these moments all the time where I always just ask, right? And I always try to get to the core of people's intentions, and I use it as teachable moments to help folks understand why the language is problematic, right? That by the very nature of the work that I do each and every day, by the very nature of the work that we're intending to do, by calling someone a diversity hire, a diverse candidate, you are automatically positioning them as a situational other before they even walk through the door, right? So it's really telling to how you view me and my
And
experiences.
lacking something, right? Because they came through the secret backdoor fast pass lane.
Absolutely. You know, it's pretty wild. But I'll just say that as our companies start transitioning more towards this politics or these practices of niceness and feel-good companies, pink and purple, go Lyft, I think that we have to be careful that we don't create a culture where we don't hold others accountable. And it's okay to hold people accountable and assume the best intentions. And sometimes it just takes asking one question to say, what did you mean by that? And each and every time, whether it was engaging with my CEO or engaging with a cross-functional partner, it's been the exact same response. I always try to get to the core of what folks are saying and then use it as a moment to understand why it's problematic.
Tariq, how would you have handled my situation?
Oh, I would have been like, well, see, I don't know. With that one, you know, I might have not had a job anymore. But, you know, a brother has to go through life and get this equity. I think for me, I would have challenged him and said, what did you mean by that, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's the easiest question in many of these scenarios. And, you know, I remember it in politics. I remember sitting down with Director Cordray at the CFPB, right? And, like, having conversations about home ownership for veterans, and the same type of sentiments come up. And a lot of these old school, I think, socialized thoughts have been ingrained in our psyche so much that we have trouble disrupting them. But I think it takes courage in many situations because you don't know what the consequences are going to be, and we've seen that in the industry of calling folks out. But I think that we wield, to be honest, the morality and the authority to be able to call folks out anytime we want to. But more importantly, we need allies to do these same things with us, right? So I think it would have felt great in that situation or in my situation for an ally to say, what did you mean by that? Mm-hmm. So that I don't always have to be the one as a man of color, as a black queer man, to have to call somebody out each and every day, right? The burden of often educating others falls on marginalized communities, and that's just tolling to constantly negotiate the world with this sense of empathy and understanding.
I need a do-over.
We'll go back. I'll roll with you.
This is practice.
Set up the meeting for sure.
This is where processing. So I want to, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Because I'm going to shift a little bit. So I'll share a few personal anecdotes that build on this, but also shift the conversation to a lot of the themes we've hit on today. So I'm a twin raised by a single mom from Chicago. Anybody know about racial politics in Chicago?
Crazy.
A mess.
Crazy. Yeah,
and then my mom, who is Puerto Rican, did not want her babies going to public school. Sorry. That was not happening because we were going to get tracked into, messy. Private schools have more resources, have more opportunities, and my babies are going to college. That was what I grew up with. And so my twin sister and I won a scholarship to high school. And my mom's rule is you can go wherever you want, but you go together. And we had the opportunity during the scholarship interview, boarding school was mentioned. Would you consider boarding school? And I'm like, if you're paying, I'm going to say yes. Because when you're from a lower middle class family and someone's giving you free money, you just say yes. And I had no idea the mess I was walking into. And so Catholic school is a school for immigrants. So I grew up in the United Nations, and then I go to Western Massachusetts, where my classmates' parents work on Wall Street. And then the diversity space was one in which blacks and Latinos went to everything together. And as a Chicagoan, I was like, what is this mess? Because that's not how I grew up. So I went in with the assumption that Latinos keep to themselves, blacks keep to themselves, Asians keep to themselves. And then I finished high school very much grounded in a multicultural social justice framework. And then I went to undergrad at Northwestern and like, why do you keep hanging out with black people? Are you black or something? And I was like, I'm not ready to unpack that conversation. And so for me, to your question about disruption, it was like, I'm gonna lean into discomfort, to borrow a phrase from, we won't go there. But more than lean in, I'm going to embrace discomfort. And I'm gonna embrace discomfort and share the story. Because when I teach, when I do research, right, because that's the other piece, if I'm going to talk about diversity, I'm going to have letters after my name because it's with letters after my name that you're going to take the knowledge I share with you seriously. And so it was really important to me to be part of the group of people creating knowledge about my communities, not only to change the conversation, but also to be in spaces like this and be like, one, I exist, 2, this is how we talk about it. And 3, this is how we disrupt, right? Because I think
Just
to
by
your
being
point,
there.
right? When people are like, well, why did you research professionals? I was like, I'm sorry. I want to finish because the percentage of Latinas completing PhDs is 1%. 1%. And I'm not talking about getting a job at Stanford because that number is even smaller, right? But I get to say I'm a researcher at Stanford, which not only brings pride to my family, but then when I engage with students of color, first-generation students, and they're like, wait, what? And I'm bringing it to them on a reel, right? To go there.
Right,
Yes,
and so that's
powerful.
important. Can we give her a hand for that, because that's important. So as we can see, and I'm coming back around Amanda, because we disrupt where we are, right? And so think about where you are based. Is it through your ERG or through the company initiatives that you're involved with? Are you disrupting the spaces you're in because you're not expected to be there, or perhaps you're a woman? There's a lot of women here today. And maybe that's unusual in where you're working. And so I want to turn to Amanda, who has created Balloonr and has this vision for how to overcome and disrupt unconscious bias through these means. But I want to ask you personally, the women perspective, right? What, from here, you're here and you see the news and you hear about it, and then you have this platform. But what can you tell us, for us women in the room and for men who are allies and others? How do we unpack all of this and be really purposeful in how to guide this moving forward? Because it's all out now, right?
Yeah.
What do we do? Tell us what to do.
Yeah, so I mean, a few things, and I'm having a ton of thoughts right now, and just appreciate all the stories and experiences. So. I think a few things here. So one is, I always think that people can change, and I think that if we don't allow people to evolve and grow and learn, then we are basically saying how the world exists now is how we want it to exist forever. And I think that that's something that is just a huge issue. So allowing people to make mistakes, to ask questions that are inappropriate and offensive and discriminatory and all those things, and allowing that to be a teachable moment is so important. And so I think that always calling people out and asking them, what did you mean by that, is so important. And I heard recently some advice that I thought was really bad, which is that when someone's saying something that's offensive or is loaded with discrimination, you say, sometimes people like X get offended by that. Well, no, you should always take ownership that you are actually offended. And I think that that's so important because you can really control that. And I think that's really important too as a role of an ally in so many situations, is to really say, you know what, that actually offends me, and here's why it offends me, and here's why you can do better. And I'm glad, I'm happy to help you do better. I think that's so important. Obviously, I'm a female founder, and male VCs are 85%
Right?
male and white.
Let's give her a hand for that. Female founders.
So male VCs, white VCs, 85%. And so, we see that all the time as female founders. What I always look for are the male VCs who invest in women, who recognize the benefit of having women run companies, which time and time again has shown to result in more revenue, stronger teams, happier workplaces, et cetera. And so, female investors say all the time, do you really want to make the other guys rich? And the answer is no. And so you really are deliberate in who you engage with, and you allow those who have invested in female-run companies to really benefit and reap the rewards of your hard work. And I think that's applicable to so many different industries in terms of who you look for as a mentor, or who you look to mentor and bring up with you. So.
Great. And from the D&I perspective, we call what you said previously, how something lands on you, it's intent versus impact, right? So if someone says, Asians are the model minority, it's really great. It's I understand that you're intending that to be flattering, but the impact of that is you're othering my colleagues who are of different cultures and races, number one. Number two, you're putting these unrealistic expectations and labeling us all as a monolith, which is not the case, because Asians, by and large, are so diverse. We have Southeast Asians and other groups that are refugees, right? And so there's no model minority about that. right? So unpacking that and us to know our history and our culture and our background within our own communities is so important. And so I think by hearing, and thank you for sharing your stories, and hearing what the origins of how we came to be is important, so let's reflect on that. Now, coming back to kind of the current state of D&I and the challenges we face, let's look at technology, right? Because of where we're located. And can you share how technology has helped us overcome challenges and maybe kind of inspire some thought around innovation and how we can leverage it? Maybe it's through access or through communication or through bringing people together. So why don't we start with Dr. Melissa? How have you seen it? Because you've interviewed a number of people. So how is technology being used, do you see, in, kind of the rising stars or the people you've talked to? We can come back to you.
I'll share a couple stories. And
Okay.
then I'll have to think about it.
Sure.
I think in some ways it's not being used to its full potential by
Okay. That's important to
groups.
know.
And I'll say this, right? So one of the things that's and this is totally a West Coast thing. LinkedIn, like people get jobs through LinkedIn, and I'm sure many of you have. But for me and the students I've worked with in the past, or just thinking about my friends who are all first-generation students, it's like, oh, wait, I need to build my profile? Yes, build your profile. Know how to build your profile because that's how you get visibility, right? But on the flip side, research has also shown, or I don't think it's, no, scratch that, something else. So we'll talk about resumes and LinkedIn. And so sometimes people of color do not reveal race, will not share they're part of a multicultural fraternity or sorority, will not show that they're members of organizations like Ascend or something, because it'll be a signal, right, that I'm different. Or so they'll either drop the last name, on LinkedIn, they'll drop their full last name, they'll hide their age, they'll use an older picture. There's all these dimensions of difference that pop up visibly on LinkedIn that people will hide to increase their likelihood of getting a job, right? Because audit studies have shown, whether it's race, gender, age, class, the list goes on, that if you are indicate difference in some way, shape, or form, you are less likely to get a job. Whether it's John Smith versus Leroy Jenkins, John Smith versus Jane Smith, etc. And so the question is like, how do we use technology? I'm not sure. It's a double-edged sword.
I love that, because I think what we'll do is we'll go to Amanda next, who's created ways to overcome that. And while we're talking, just know that we have audience Q&A coming up. So if you have any questions, start thinking about them. We're going to do it live and ask you. So get ready, warm up, okay? Because we're going to turn the lights on you next. So if you could please share, Amanda, maybe can you tell us about your company? I'd love to hear more about how it works and how it can help us overcome bias.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, first of all, I believe that bias mitigation is the next wave of productivity, and inclusion is really the next wave of productivity. And so, we're seeing more and more companies, more and more tools to really address this, from hiring, like Textio, Talent Sonar, Scout, et cetera, and then things that are actually like in the workforce and in the workplace. So, so Balloonr removes these most costly types of bias. So I mentioned some of them before, but we really looked at what are those most costly types of bias. So what results in bad decision making, stalls innovation, and wastes the most time. And then also, how do you provide psychological safety, remove a fear of failure, ensure that people's voices are amplified within the workforce and within the workplace. And so with that, we really believe that so many of these different types of bias, which research shows time and time again, when people say, I don't have bias, or, I'm not biased, or all these things, like, it's just false and impossible. And so we see so much power in technology to not only surface and amplify all these voices, but really, when ideas or feedback that's put forward is evaluated, to ensure that all these different types of bias that are tied to identity and person and area of expertise, et cetera, are influencing what really surfaces within an organization. And so that's really the background of Balloonr. We use Balloonr within our customers, within companies, but we've also done Balloonrs across industries. So we recently did a Balloonr with 94 female founders and investors to surface solutions for how you fix Silicon Valley sexism problem, and we're going to be doing similar initiatives across entertainment, sports, and politics, but really focused on how do you just eliminate all these different types of bias to surface and amplify voices.
Is there enough data on efficacy of how that's working so far, or are we still waiting?
Yeah, so lots of data on it in terms of time saved, voices heard,
Nice.
uniqueness of data and
Right.
information that's surfaced across the board. So yeah, across our customers.
Great. Super. You can pass. That's fine. Tariq.
Yeah.
Or just the creation of Lyft, doesn't it? Because it provides access, like what you're saying, right? I mean democratizing the ability to get places and having choice and access, right? I mean, I think that's part of it.
I think it's part of it. I mean, I think technology, when I think about hiring and other things, technology for me, it's a double-edged sword. Like, one, I don't have enough apps. Like, it's actually kind of weird. I don't really use much but, like, Lyft and my calculator on payday. Because you got a brother got a budget these days. It's hard out here. But in all seriousness, I think that what's beautiful about technology, whether it's Balloonr or others, is that it's extended our reach to be able to impact people's lives, right? And that's beautiful. For me, from a hiring standpoint, solely focused on that, or even from a pipeline standpoint, I'm inspired by the fact that we've been able to touch places and access communities like never before. For me, when I think about how our organizations have grown and scaled, obviously I think many of us work for referral-dependent organizations, or especially in our growth. So, we're hiring our friends or referring our friends to get pretty cool referral bonuses and all that other jazz. But then we leave a lot of people out. So it's a double-edged sword. I love working with Teamable. It's a great referral app that has really helped us really shape the landscape for how we think about sourcing for building diverse teams. But the challenge that comes with technology's reach is that we're actually not building authentic relationships with communities anymore. And it's kind of scaring me, right? I think what we're realizing is that we're having the development of these technologies like sourcing tools, and I can find out if you're a Johnson or a Jackson or a Myers, and I throw them off. I'm Tariq Meyers. They would never guess that's who's going to walk through the door, so it's great. But I see all of these different like last name searches and all this other jazz and these tools that do this, and it gives me the chills sometimes because I think what we're missing, we're treating folks like a talent harvest, right? We're going to get as many people of color and underrepresented groups, into a database, into a page, and we're just going to sort through all of them, right? Sort through all their identities. Like a talent harvest. We're going to choose, and then we're going to onboard them. And so I think what's happening in the industry, though, is that we're missing the opportunity to build authentic relationships with community-based organizations and actually bring the center to the margins, rather than being like our big bad companies who are saying, come work for us, come work for us. So I think what we're seeing in the industry is that there's a shift where now underrepresented communities know that our companies are competing for their talent and they have a choice. In the economic justice world, we call it buying power. I think, in the HR space or in the inclusion diversity space, I think it's talent power. So I worry about technology sometimes because the more and more we have access to shoot our beams of light, or where we're calling them, into communities, the more we're missing the opportunity to actually live and be in the communities that we're trying to recruit from. So I go back and forth. I think there are some dynamic tools out there that are broadening the opportunity landscape, but I just don't want to miss out on the opportunity to do it the old school way, which is to show up and show out, right? And really invest in the communities that you're serving.
That's fair. Thank you. Okay, we're going to turn to audience Q&A. Any burning questions in the room? Mr. Buck. Of course. Waiting for the mic to come around. Great.
Thanks, Farzana. So I have a quick story and then a question and suggestion to Carmela. Okay. Quick story is this. At Cisco, we had a meeting with John Chambers to talk about, who was the CEO back then, of Cisco, and to talk about Asians in Cisco. And John started the meeting by saying, I'm glad there's so many Asian executives at Cisco. Asian leadership has been great at Cisco, blah, blah, blah. And I interrupted John and said, actually, John, that's not right. There's actually very few of us at Cisco. And John said, yeah, I didn't know that. And as a result of that meeting, he gave us $250,000 to do a leadership development program in Cisco. So the lesson from that was that people like John Chambers or Mark Benioff get it. They want to do the right thing. So my suggestion to you is, Carmela, is how do you or can you set up a meeting with Mark Benioff and point out the fact that, because I looked on the web, of the 12 executives on your website and the 12 board members' website, There are women, there are blacks, there's Hispanics. There's only one minority missing on your website, and that's Asian. So, as I said, I believe they want to do the right thing, but does he know that?
Wow, Buck.
This is about disrupting, right?
Oh, yeah. You're totally disrupting this. It is something that I have noticed. It is something that has been discussed, the bamboo ceiling. We do have, and we have a contingent of Salesforce employees here. Our highest level employee that is of Asian American descent is Srini Talipragada, right? It's something that I don't know. I don't know if Mark Benioff is aware of that, but I think to your point, if we had given him a suggestion regarding that, I think he would take it into consideration because he is that kind of CEO. So no, thank you for that insight. I mean, something that I've seen, but it's one of those things where, it's an ongoing discussion and something that I can talk with my ERG leads as well as my counterparts over here about how to approach, right?
And the idea that it's not fully on your shoulders, right? Like to have your executive sponsor or other allies or other people in positions of power and privilege to be able to help broach that conversation. I mean, all too often it rests upon us to raise the issue, and it shouldn't just be us, right? But at the same time, why not let it be us? Because we need to speak and come together, and there's enough of us, right? So as you think about your next question, audience, I want to share that I was at a conference in LA. I live in LA, and it was the director of Pandora was there, and he did a branding workshop. He's Asian. It was an Asian conference. And a gentleman in the audience put his hand up, and he said, you know, when I'm making my resume, and you know, you're talking about LinkedIn and people seeing who I look like, and they look at me, and they're like, another Asian guy, right? Well, how do I make myself stand out because there's so many Asians in the field that I am? And so it might be even opposite of what the folks on the panel are talking about, because we're overrepresented in engineering and tech in some places, and then at the same time we don't have representation at the high levels. So we have a very unique space that we're in, where we're definitely qualified, educated, all that stuff, right? But at the same time, we can't break through that. And so we don't have the ability to say we're underrepresented because we're overrepresented, right? And that hurts us too, because how are we supposed to stand out? And so I want to call that into the room, because this is a very specific thing that our community is dealing with. And it is a puzzle. I don't know if we have the answer right now, right? And ERGs also. I mean, part of it is, hey, you know, we're good, we're working, we've got jobs. Why rattle the cage? But we need to want more for ourselves as individuals, as a community, and seeing leaders who are absent. Because if we don't have that, how are the doors going to open for more, right? So I see a hand go up if you want to respond, or if you have another question.
I had a question related to that.
Okay.
Also to what talking.
Okay. Sure.
So I think it's interesting that we're bringing up the bamboo ceiling, and thank you for pointing out that, you know, there aren't as many high-level leadership in Salesforce that are Asian American. And so one brief response to that is that our Office of Equality, our Chief Diversity Officer, Tony Proffitt, does send out scorecards to our top-level leaders of the makeup of their organization. And so the first step, I think, is awareness. And so if you have the data, but my question is, what do you do with it next? So now that, you know, our chief officers and their directs are aware that we have a problem, what's the next step in your perspectives?
Anyone want to take that?
I'll take that.
Sure.
So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. So I'm a researcher, but what informs my research is, one, being Catholic, and that's separate. But I think more importantly, I was trained by community organizers early enough in my career that started my research on immigration / that turned into women of color, which is a separate story. But I share that to say, what do you do with the data? What's your ask, right? And so one of the things that I've loved about today is I've heard a lot of problem naming, but no action steps. And so when I was at the executive roundtable earlier before lunch, I asked who's a community organizer. I think one or has a community organizing background. One person raised their hand, and I was like, of course you did, because you were the one who brought up power. And so you do with the data, what's the goal with the data, right? And two, how do you get enough stakeholders who have less to lose than you, right? If you feel like you're in a precarious position, to push for that ask, right? So it's, you get the data, you clarify, you make an articulate ask, and you educate key stakeholders who can push the agenda to do the ask for you, right? Because if you align your stakeholders and your power, if you do, so it's not just the data, but it's also doing an asset map of who's gonna make the push and who's gonna make the ask and who can have the lunch. It could be you, but if you are emotionally exhausted from all the emotional labor you have to engage in because you have to explain why you deserve that, put it on somebody else's shoulders. And it's those allies, it's those friendships that maybe you don't bring it up, that maybe you just test the waters and say, well, who can make the ask and who can make the push? Because I'm sure there's someone who's aware of it, but doesn't know how to translate the data into the ask.
I just want to add to that quickly,
Sure.
if I can.
Go ahead, there's a mic right there on your right.
So I think I feel you, right? Because I think a lot of times, so I also send out a scorecard, and a lot of people don't know what to do with the scorecard, which is like my first learning is like, oh, here's the data, like, okay, like B+, oh great, I got a B+, you know, so some people are really happy with the C, from what I've learned. Won't name names, but I think, so I think it's the partnership that you have as an ERG leader, or as with your executive sponsor, the relationship that you have with that department or that specific unit's business partner, the talent acquisition team, the executive team, that relationship, it literally takes a team to think about this. So one of the challenges that we found, and I'll be transparent because I think it's important, is that, you know, when you grow an organization that, isn't as diverse as it could be at the leadership level. That's my corporate answer. But there's just not a lot of representation in general at the leadership level, and the organization grows out, departments grow out. You know, when you start thinking about succession planning, like when you get this inflection point in a company's growth where you start thinking about succession planning and you realize that the next 5 people in line will not add to the diversity of a team, you have to start being a lot more strategic, right? About how you create positions, about how you're hiring folks, about how you're building pipeline. So this was one of the challenges that we had, right? We were like, okay, you know, it's great that we have, leaders here and there, who are from underrepresented groups one way or the other. But one of the challenges that we had to do is, okay, what policies or practices are we going to put in play to disrupt what's been going on? So one of the things that we implemented after raising a very similar issue to our CEO was a Rooney Rule for all director level and above positions, right? But the Rooney Rule is great. But what complements the Rooney Rule is really looking, and it's actually an exhausting process, but I literally go department by department and meet with each and every senior executive, and rather than setting company-wide goals for what we want our diversity targets to be, I literally look at each and every team and I say, where are we over-rotating, right, and where are we under-rotating? So rather than, again, this whole talent harvest idea and creating this big paintbrush and this big picture, we take a real decentralized approach to growing the diversity of our teams, right? So one of the challenges, and I think this is the industry challenges that we see, is that, you know, we have an overrepresentation of Asian and Pacific Islanders in technical capacities, right? Even though they still reach a ceiling, but then we have a grotesque underrepresentation in like business development roles and business operation roles and G&A functions. But by taking this decentralized approach, we were actually able to identify which department heads needed to grow their Asian and Pacific Islander leadership, and then which department heads needed to over-rotate elsewhere. It takes forever to do, but we found it very meaningful and also an education opportunity for folks. So the comments that we were getting before about this person and that person not being a culture fit and unpacking truly what was at the root of that for a lot of G&A functions ended up being a teaching moment. We were able to really identify some pretty solid capabilities for where we wanted to grow the team.
Nice. That's a great macro level answer. Okay, we have a couple minutes. What I'd like you to do actually is I want you to turn to the person next to you, and I'd like you to think of maybe one issue that you would like to take action on, right, in your own work or world, and discuss that, right? We have about 3 minutes left, but I want to make this meaningful because there's been a lot of discussion, but let's bring it home to you, okay? We'll come back after that. So a couple minutes, turn to someone next to you. It could be within the Asian community or being as a woman or tech overall, whatever it is. One issue that you can take action on and how you're going to do it. Okay, go ahead. Okay, well, let's just come back to the front. And we're going to wrap up. So, okay. All right. So let's wrap up. We're actually ending the session early, if that piques your interest. Okay. Really quick. Can we have, let's just, couple show of hands. Could someone share really briefly in a sentence what you're going to do to take action on, right? One thing. Who can share? Yes. That's you. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, we have a mic.
Sorry.
Yeah. That's cool. You're like, I'm done. So here we go.
So thank you.
Very
both for
briefly.
the-
Very
yes.
briefly.
Just thank you for the answer. And I'm actually in charge of our scorecard, so I will go to my chief diversity or equality officer and talk to him about representation of Asians, because that's not something that we
Nice.
always focus on.
Okay, let's give her a hand. Thank you. Very good. Another one over there. Thank you. We're going to do this really brief so we hear as many as we can.
As the executive sponsor for the D&I committee, I will ensure that for 2018 they know that we have an organizational health goal company-wide in how we are going to tie in the work that the D&I committee wants to do all, at the corporate level.
Thank you. Let's give her a hand. And let's do one more. And by the way, you can tweet these, right? Candy said, I commit, and then hashtag, right? So we can make these as commitments. Anyone else this side of the room? Over here? Don't be shy. Yes. Mike, this way.
So one thing that Jenny and I discussed was that the next time someone says something that's a little bit off, we
Okay.
should have at the ready, what did you mean by that? And so then we
Good.
can, in that way we can have a discussion and a teachable moment instead of just brushing it under the rug.
Good. I'm so glad because we spent a lot of time on that today, and I was like, I don't know if we're all feeling this conversation. So I'm glad that we got something out of it. So thank you. Let's give them a hand for saying that. Good. Okay, we are done here. Can we give our panelists a big round of applause? Thank you for sharing everything you did. Really, really heartfelt, very genuine, and also, I mean, I just admire how far they've come in their careers and what they've done. So it's just a proud moment for us to have them all here. So, yes, thank you.